Welcome back to Community Video Presents. Once again, we are featuring the artists of Iron Raven Metals. This time, it will show us the forging process. To see some of their other works, go to ironravenmetals.com. Enjoy the show.
Metals have been forged since the original alloys 5,000–6,000 years BC. And it's a process that involves essentially heating the metal, in this case it'll be steel, to the point of becoming plastic. We excite the atoms in the material, and as they move around, the material loses its rigidity, and we're able to push it around a little bit. It's a gas forge. Our preferred method of heat would be coal, but it doesn't really justify just being hotter and easier to deal with and more economical. Doesn't justify the difficulty with the emissions problem. So we burn natural gas, a much cleaner fuel, and the forge will get up to about 2,400–2,500 degrees, somewhere in that ballpark, depending on how hot we want to run. The heat from the forge heats everything in the room, and so even though we'll be forging on a day that's sub-zero, the building itself can be 100 degrees. One of the things that becomes really critical is the heat ratio. As you start to forge that material and it thins out, the thinner the material, the more susceptible it is to burning. The heat is exciting the atoms, they're bouncing around, and it's actually changing the chemical composition. Carbon is rising to the surface of the material, and if you overheat, it'll actually carbonize and granulate the material. So, and at that point it becomes very brittle and can crack, and the delicate nature, the balance of knowing how hot the material is and when it's ready for hammering and when it's ready to get off hammering and go back to heat, that's exactly the difference between bashing the material around and actually forging with the intent of creating movement, directed movement. These calla lily flowers are essentially the typical blacksmith standby shapes, you know, much like everyone's familiar with the scroll. It's a taper and movement of material, and all you do is you're moving it in one direction down to a smaller circumference. In this case, we're actually spreading the material and starting with that ½ inch diameter, but spreading it out into this fan shape, which we'll illustrate a little later, and then rolling that around, and then eventually tapering out the stem. And the actual moving of the material, essentially these are typical hammers, ball peen, cross peen, and you can imagine when you strike with a cross peen, the metal moves forward and backward from the peen. Ball peen, when you strike with that, the metal moves in all directions around the point of impact. Behind me is our air hammer. It's a German-made machine that essentially has interchangeable dies. The very specific shape of the die has everything to do with the way that material moves. And so what happens with the air hammer is that the dies are moving up and down in a predictable pattern. And depending on the shape of those dies, we know the material is going to move in a certain way. The second process after the initial pointing of the material is to fan the paddle shape that gets rolled around to become the cone of the flower. That process is using our deep draw die sideways to create that paddle shape, working the material lengthwise and forcing it sideways and around. And you'll notice in the process the way you walk the material back and forth across the machine, and using that die, essentially with every stroke of the hammer, you're pushing that material and you're watching it move around and around. And if you just work back and forth, you'd have a square shape. By working it in that round formation, you actually get a cone shape or a triangle shape that will roll into a cone after the fact. Once that triangle paddle shape is forged out, it's ready to curl around into this flower form. We've got a series of dies much like this, essentially every different process that you need to do in blacksmithing. They don't really make, there's no commercial source for tools, so you make your own dies and jigs. This particular one allows us to lay that flat paddle in, and then using the cross peen, form that into what will be our initial beginning cone. Back to the horn of the anvil to work the outside and draw that cone around. And one of the things that's difficult is to try to create that cone shape without collapsing the flower form. So you'll see us go back to the horn of the anvil to inflate essentially the inside of that hollow cone shape if we've crushed it a little, and then to create this tapered transition that will eventually get forged out into the stem. And that transition is really critical. It's you have to fight a little bit to get that to go from the lumpiness of where our paddle form started to the actual thinness of what becomes the pedal. Once that cone shape is made, then the last thing that we'd end up going in and doing is to actually manipulate the edges to create something that has an organic feel. This little bit of distortion around the rim of the flower is what really takes it from the point of being a geometric shape to a natural form. And then our final thing, depending on the process we're doing, in this case these will be used as candle holder receivers, so we don't put a stamen inside of this, but if it was decorative for a gate or something like that, then we'd make a stamen go in from the outside, penetrate through the outside, and then plug weld that stamen in and metal finish it back so that it appeared to be an integral part of an initial part of the design. One of the things that we try to achieve in forging these pieces is not beyond the economy of being able to make an object from a single piece of metal. We are impressing a character into the metal that is very lifelike. And so it's one of the things that I find really exciting about blacksmithing is that we can take something as rigid as steel and as cold as this extruded bar, and by heat and hammer, essentially heat and pressure, create something that's delicate and very lifelike, and actually a close second to a real calla lily. It's in that contrast between the material and the natural appearance that I think you find some beauty that doesn't exist, or at least that's part of the artistry that we try to create through blacksmithing.